Ezekiel 33:3.
All right, welcome to the Wednesday night Bible studies. We're going to look at Genesis chapters 6 to 11 today. Our agenda is we're going to review the study from last week. We'll be taking a look at the genealogy of Adam. We'll do an overview of Genesis chapters 6 to 11. We'll do a closer analysis of some details we saw in Genesis 6 specifically. We'll look at some questions from the study, and then we'll look at our reading for next week. So a review from last study is we took a look at the 7 days of creation. So 6 days the world was made, and on the seventh God had rested. We took a look that a day in the Bible is recorded from evening to evening. We see that with each day in creation. Normally we're used to looking at 12 o'clock, midnight, that's the new day. That's not how it works in the Bible. In the Bible, it describes it as an evening to an evening because, of course, you wouldn't be able to tell when exactly midnight is back in ancient times. Obviously, today with clocks, it's not a problem, but back then you're using sundials, and of course, the middle of the night, that's not going to be very effective. We took a look at the difference between the Sabbath versus the Lord's Day. There is, in fact, a difference. The Catholics on their website, thevatican.va, they have defined exactly what the Lord's Day is and gave some history behind that. We saw the Lord's Day is associated to the resurrection, where the Sabbath is associated to the seventh day of rest. We took a look at the serpents, the fall, and the lineage of Adam. And then we looked at something very interesting in Genesis 4:26, men calling themselves the name of the Lord. A lot of people read this verse too quickly. It's translated in English as saying that men began to proclaim the name of the Lord. The word proclaim is the Hebrew word shalal. And then we noticed that in the 1611 King James Version, in the side notes, they actually wrote in there that men were calling themselves God, making themselves into idols. So it looks like the word shalal was mistranslated. It became proclaim, or the word begin, instead of the word profane. So we're going to take a look at the genealogy of Adam, and we'll go from Adam to the flood, since that's what we're covering today. So some major points on the genealogy. We have Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve were in the garden. Once they got kicked out of the garden, we had Cain and Abel. Cain the elder, Abel the younger. Cain slew his brother Abel. And then following this, Adam and Eve had another child called Seth. Now, if we look at this genealogy, we're only seeing Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel, and Seth. Adam and Eve had other children. This is mentioned later in Genesis. So there were more children than just than just Cain, Abel, and Seth. They had other brothers and sisters as well. We know this also because Cain had a wife, and Cain's wife was his sister. So some of the major things to look at on this timeline, Enosh, so E-N-O-S, he's important because we see him come onto the scene in Genesis 4:26, and this is the first time in the entire Bible we see the word L-O-R-D in uppercase written in the Bible. Prior to that, all we see is the word God translated as Elohim. All of a sudden, like I said, in the days of Enosh, we just have this random appearance of Lord. It wasn't provided to the people in the days of Enosh, and we took a look last week and we found that in Exodus 6:3, it points out the fact that God didn't provide the people with that name. So when Moses had that name, the Lord, that wasn't a name that God had ever provided the people with. So we can tell that that came to fruition in the days of Enosh, and we found that men were not calling upon the name of the Lord. According to the 1611 King James Bible and a couple other sources, men were actually calling themselves by the name of the Lord. They were calling themselves a god. So they were making themselves into an idol. In the days of Jared, we see him first introduced a little bit earlier, but in Genesis 6:4, when the sons of God come unto the daughters of man, that was in the days of Jared. And then also Noah, we see Noah come on the scene. He's mentioned in Genesis 6:8 for the first time. So what looks like what happened here is something occurred between the days of Enosh and Noah, where iniquity started to just blossom in the world. We'll take a look as to some of the reasons as to why as we approach later into the chapters. So starting off with our overview of Genesis chapter 6. Genesis 6, the sons of God come unto the daughters of man, and they have offspring. We'll take a look at that a little bit later. The wickedness of mankind increased so much that God repented of his creation. God sought to destroy all his creation, but found grace for Noah. Noah was instructed to build an ark. God made a covenant, remember that means an agreement, with Noah to keep him, his wife, sons, and the animals that entered the ark alive. So one of the questions that's commonly asked is, how big was the ark? And what is a cubit? because we see that measurement show up in the Old Testament. Genesis 6:15, and this is the fashion which thou shalt make of it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, and the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. So we've got 300 cubits in length for the ark, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Now we have to convert that to a modern measurement to get a better understanding of what that would be. So Noah's cubit. Though the original cubit length is uncertain, it was most likely one of the royal cubits, about 19.8 to 20.6 inches. We'll take a look at that shortly. If so, the ark was bigger than the size described in most books today, which frequently use the short cubit. In large-scale construction projects, ancient civilizations typically used the royal cubit, about 19.8 to 20.6 or 52 centimeters. The Hebrews used at least 2 different cubits. So actually, as we read, you'll find that when you read the 2 Chronicles 3:3, they'll talk about a former measure, and that kind of alludes to the idea that there's 2 types of cubit measures. So on this next chart here, if you take a look, if you see this Egyptian man here, you can see the cubit is actually a measurement from the elbow to the fingers. So how long is a cubit? A cubit is an ancient measurement of length based on the distance from the elbow to the tip of the longest finger. Now, of course, since some people are taller, some people are shorter, some people have longer arms, shorter arms, on this chart here, you can see that there was some slight variations in regards to the length of a cubit, depending on who you were speaking to. So in the Hebrew mindset, we're looking at 17.5 inches. That's the short cubit. We had the Egyptian short cubit, which was 17.6. And then you can see these next couple are called long cubits. This would be like your royal cubit. This is used for like your large building projects. Babylonian long is 19.8 inches. Hebrew long was 20.4 inches. And again, this is an estimation. Egyptian long is 20.6 inches. So there actually was a life-size ark that has been recreated. It's called the Ark Encounter. You can actually check this out in the United States. This is a life-size version of the ark based on what was provided in the book of Genesis. So it's built to scale.
This week on Way of the Master.
Those of you that are thinking, man, I wish there was a way where we could see the scope and the size of Noah's Ark. Well, guess what? You can now, because our good friend, Mr. Ken Ham, has actually built one, a full-size replica of Noah's Ark. And I had the privilege, yes, me, your lowly Arab host, had the privilege to go to the Ark and tour it with Ken Ham. Check this out. I remember sometime back when you first told me about your plans to build the Ark. And then the day came when I finally made it over and I rounded that corner and I actually saw it. I mean, it's overwhelming. And when you look at pictures, you just can't appreciate the size. In fact, when I show people pictures, I have to zoom in to say, those are people there. Those things that look like ants, they're human beings, you know?
Well, think about the length of this for the moment. It's 1.5 times the length of a football field. It's half the width of a football field. That's 3.3 million board feet of timber.
Wow.
So it's 510 feet long, 85 feet wide, 51 feet high. From ground level here, where you see there's people walking, from ground level to the top of the roof is 7 stories, but to the top of the bow there is 10 stories. It is the biggest what's called timber frame structure in the world.
Well, I want to look at all that. So let's go inside, Ken, and I want you to take me to some of your favorite exhibits and help people understand why it is you put this thing up in the first place.
Okay, let's do it.
All right, let's go. Factor just keeps increasing. So tell us what's going on.
Well, the storm has started. You can hear it in the background. You hear the thunder.
Right.
You can see the lightning now and then. And there he is, entrusting their voyage now to the Lord because he knew they were going to protect them.
It's interesting because I think people think Noah just threw a bunch of animals on the ark and they just kind of ran around in this open thing. But I mean, this is sophisticated. You know, there's a feeding system. There's order.
In fact, we have exhibits on how he could have looked after them and fed them and be able to take away their waste.
Oh, great. Well, let's keep going. Show me what else is going on down here. I've seen signs all around the ark that have the word kinds on them. And I'm looking here, this says the sloth kind. So can you explain that?
Well, you know, when we did the research on what do you want answered, question I've heard over and over again is, well, how could Noah's Ark be true? It couldn't fit all the animals on board. But people are thinking in terms of species, today's species. The Bible says kind.
Right.
And so here on the first deck, we start to introduce that idea to help people understand kind is different to species. Lots of species within a kind.
Right, right.
You know, the representatives of the kind, probably at the family level classification, went on board the Ark, and then you have lots of speciation since then. And once people grasp that, they realize Noah didn't need anywhere near the number of animals on the Ark that we think. Wow, you could fit all the kinds of land animals needed, representative kinds.
That's awesome.
So there's two really things that are important to take a look at here. Two things. Well, first off is we don't know exactly what the age of the animals were. If we took infants on there, that'd be very different than taking full-grown animals. The second thing to keep in mind is we didn't take animal species onto the boat, we took kind. So that really limits how many animals would have been on the boat. Spanning 510 feet long, 85 feet wide, and 51 feet high, this modern engineering marvel amazes visitors young and old. Ark Encounter is situated in beautiful Grand County, Williamston, Kentucky. So what went into the Ark? Fowls, cattle, and creeping things were taken into the Ark. Every clean beast were taken by 7, male and female. Every unclean beast were taken by 2, male and female. Now, this is the first time we see the word clean and unclean mentioned in the Bible. It's obviously known to Noah, but we don't actually see the definition of clean and unclean until later in, I believe, Leviticus. Noah and his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth, as well as their wives. So that's everything that went in the Ark. Everything else died. Every other flesh that lived on the earth, animals, man, gone. Overview of Genesis chapter 7. In Genesis 7, Noah was commanded to go into the ark, and it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Noah was 600 years old when the flood came. Everything on earth containing the breath of life had died. The waters did not recede for 150 days. The highest mountains were 15 cubits underwater, or 306 feet. Okay, so then the highest mountains you would see in the world, the tops of those mountains were covered by 306 feet of water. Genesis 6:11 says, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month of the 17th day of the month, on that day all fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. If you remember from last week when we looked at the cosmology of the earth, we can see that in the Bible we have a firmament, which was like a hard shell that covered the sky, and beneath it the sun, the moon, the stars were underneath this hardened shell. There were fountains that were at the bottom. So you look at the great deep, you'll see the foundations of the earth. Water was coming up from the fountains below, and water was also coming down from the windows of heaven and the firmament that opened above. So we're having water coming from a multitude of places, from below, from above, and then from the clouds raining down. And this is how the world filled up with water so quickly. Genesis chapter 8. A wind blew over the earth, and the water subsided. On the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to a rest on Mount Ararat. Now, there's some speculation as to where this mountain is. Some people speculate it's somewhere in Turkey. In the 10th month, the tops of the mountains could be seen. Noah sent out a raven and a dove in search of dry land. After the dove came back with an olive branch, he sent it out again, and after 7 days, it did not return. So at that point, Noah knew, okay, there must be dry land because this dove didn't come back. It finally left and remained out of the ark. On the 601 year of the first month and the first day, the waters had receded. Now, 601 year, what we're talking about here is the age of Noah. Remember, Noah got in the ark when he was 600. Noah, his family, and the animals got out of the ark. And then Noah built an altar to God, who made a covenant, that's an agreement, with Noah, that he would never again strike down every living creature. We take a look at Genesis 8:4-5. So in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to a rest on the mountains of Ararat. So if we take a look here, we can see Tishri. We have the 7th month. We have a star down there. So this is when the ark came to a rest. And then we can see that the water, the tops of the mountains were able to be seen because the water had started to drop. And we see this in the 10th month. So there we can see there were a couple months in between when the ark stopped versus when the water actually started to lower enough so you could see the tops of the mountains. Now, if you take a look at the Hebrew calendar, I will point out but some of the month names aren't exactly accurate with what you'll see in parts of the Old Testament. You'll find a whole series of months that kind of swap in, swap out, or I wouldn't say swap out, but they change as you'd see the Israelites go into captivity. So for example, if you look at March, April, you'll see the month of Nisan. The month of Nisan was not the name of the original month. Basically, after you saw them go into captivity the first time in Assyria, they came back with the month of Nisan. So it looks like what's going on is you're seeing the Israelites, as they go into captivity, they take some of the customs, rituals, traditions, names of gods, and they start to apply them to their calendar. We see the same thing in the month of July, June. Later in the Bible, we see of a individual called Tammuz. Tammuz is listed here on the calendar. This was likely after they came out of Babylon. So quite often we'll see differences in the calendar where the month will be numbered, but the name won't match necessarily what you see in the Bible, because it depends on when you're looking at this calendar and what captivity you are looking at. Overview of Genesis chapter 9. Noah is provided with a new diet. God tells Noah that he may not eat the blood of any animal. God's covenant with Noah is given to him with a sign. Noah planted a vineyard, he got drunk, and his son Ham did something to him, and there's some speculation as to what happened. Noah lived 950 years, with 350 of those years after the flood. So the bulk of Noah's life was lived before the flood, and he lived another approximate third of his life outside of the ark after the flood. Also, it mentions here that Noah was told not to eat the blood of any animal. We're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into that as well. Genesis 9. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. As I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require reckoning for the life of man. So the original diet that we saw in the earlier chapters of Genesis, we were talking about plants, kind of like a vegan kind of a diet. Every plant bearing seed and tree was food. Now we're saying that, okay, you can eat meat, however, you can't eat the blood in the meat. So this is a change. Something must have happened, obviously, from before the flood, where the diet had changed from what we saw in the earlier chapters of Genesis. I would attribute that to something that happened in Genesis 6, but we'll take a look at that a little bit later. In Genesis 9, and God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations." I will point out it says for all future generations. There's no timeline on this. "I have set my bow in the cloud, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh." Okay, so a covenant was made with Noah, well, with the earth, Noah and the families, saying basically that God is not going to flood the world again. I'm not going to destroy all the flesh on the earth again. And the sign was shown by a rainbow. This is the bow that was going through the clouds. We're going to take a look at the overview of Genesis chapter 10. In Genesis chapter 10, we really focus on the genealogy of Noah. So if we look at Noah's genealogy, remember we started off with Adam and Eve and then worked our way down to Noah. Now we're just looking at Noah and looking at after the flood here. So Noah had 3 sons. These 3 sons entered the ark with him, so they did exist before the flood. Noah's sons and their wives entered the ark. So Japheth, Ham, and Shem. Japheth, I'm going to point out a couple sons worth noting. Javan. So since we're dealing with the idea of the earth being completely destroyed and then starting to reproduce all over again, we should be able to identify some of these children, because quite commonly what you would find in the Bible is an area would be named after an individual. So for example, if we take a look at the name Javan are the Greeks. You'll find the name Ionian also comes up. As a matter of fact, if you look down a little bit farther at some of the other children, it helps a little bit. Tarshish and Kittim can help identify, because Tarshish is something that comes up when you read about the British and their ships. And then Kittim is the island of Cyprus. As a matter of fact, even parts of Greece were called Kittim or Chittim. So this should really help solidify the idea that Javan is just a very early name for what we would call Greeks today. Magog, I would speculate would be around Russia area. If we take a look at some of the other children like Ham, we have the Hamites. The Hamites, another way you could look at that is Africa. So Hamites, we see Cush, Mizraim, Phut, Canaan. So Phut is Libya. Mizraim is Egypt. As a matter of fact, I'm going to show you a slide very shortly here where you can actually see that Egypt and Mizraim are used interchangeably in some Bible translations. And then Cush, where we see Nimrod. This is where we had the Tower of Babel. Now, the interesting thing with Ham is Ham was supposed to reside in Africa. However, some of Ham's children, for example, the Canaanites, and if we look at Nimrod, they didn't reside where they were supposed to. We find more details about this actually in one of the Deuterocanonical books of the Bible, where the sons Japheth, Ham, and Shem actually come together in front of a well of oaths, and they swear that they will stay within their own charted land areas. This obviously didn't happen, and this gives some explanation as to why was the promised land the promised land. There was land that was promised to Shem. They had taken an oath, and when that oath was broken, over time, eventually Shem came in through Joshua and then conquered the area that was his. If we take a look, we can see under Shem, Shem is the bloodline where we eventually get to Christ. So with Shem, we'll find King David, Solomon a little bit later down the line. But if we take a look under Eber and then go to Peleg, near the bottom there, we see Terah and Abram. Abram is Abraham. Abraham was renamed when he was 90 years old. He was called Abram up until that point. This is how the land was supposed to be divided. So Ham was supposed to reside in Africa, and then Shem was supposed to stay in this area of Mesopotamia, and then Europe and Asia, this was the large chunk that was occupied by Japheth. So this was where they were supposed to reside, and you can actually see on this map here, it shows Canaan. Canaan has encroached into the area here that is Mesopotamia. However, he wasn't supposed to be there. In Genesis 10:13, we can see Egypt written as Mizraim. It just depends on the translation. Egypt was the father of the Ludites, and then it goes on. And if we take a look at different translations, you can see that Egypt or Mizraim are used interchangeably. If you take a look at the Jewish Virtual Library, you can get confirmation that the Javites are in fact the Greeks. The name Javin reflects the Greek heroic name Ion, the legendary ancestor of the Ionians, a section of the Greek people. And then also I mentioned that the Hamites were supposed to be in Africa. If you take a look here, this is actually an old map. It's from Germany, 1932 ethnographic map portraying the Hamites. In German, you can see it's called Hamitan, as a subdivision of the Caucasian race. So here we can see all the way up to the 1930s. Ham in the Bible was located in Africa or parts of Africa. So just more clarification here that the Bible is not based on make-believe. The story is not a story, it's historical, which is why you can find history books with the names of these children showing up. And all we've really done in these modern times is change the names on a map, change the country names. Overview of Genesis chapter 11. In Genesis chapter 11, we found the entire people spoke one language. The building of the Tower of Babel and the city. There's a lot of focus sometimes put on the tower. There was a tower and a city that they built. The scattering of the people after their language was divided into 70. So we know that their language was divided. From some extra books, we can actually figure out how many divisions there were. I'll show you that shortly. We'll look at the descendants of Shem, the descendants of Terah. Terah is Abraham's father. And then Abraham moved from the land of Ur in Chaldea to Canaan, but stopped in Haran. So Chaldea you can look at as Babylon, kind of like a synonym. Babylon is where you had Abraham growing up, and then eventually what happened was he was moving his way into Canaan, but then stopped in Haran before finally making his way into Canaan. Now, one thing that's important to point out here is the descendants of Shem. Again, just speaking to the historical nature of the Bible, since we're dealing with history, who was Shem? Well, interestingly enough, in the world today, we have probably 1/3 of the world actually identify as being a descendant of Shem. The word Shem has an SH, which wasn't able to be translated accordingly into Greek or into Latin. And so what ended up happening was the SH sound becoming SE sound. So sh becomes s. So Shemite is Semite. So the Shemites were the sons of Shem. When we say the word Semitic people means sons of Shem. So today we have Jews that identify as obviously being sons of Shem because they came through the line of Abraham and then Isaac and then Jacob, and Jacob is Israel, and that's where the Jews came from. So we have Shem. We also have the Muslims. The Muslims identify as being related to Abraham through Ishmael, and Abraham and Ishmael were also sons of Shem. And then, of course, we have Christians who are adopting a religion of Shem. They follow the God of Shem. So we have 1/3 of the world identifying with Shem, meaning that if Shem didn't exist, it looks kind of silly because 1/3 of the world seems to claim that he did, either through religion or through blood relation. The Tower of Babel, this is an artist's illustration of what the tower may have looked like. We don't actually know. I suspect that there might have been a physical element, but also a spiritual element, something that was not seen by the eyes. So with this tower, it was never fully completed. So when you see images of the tower itself, you'll notice that it looks like it's still under construction. And the tower was supposed to reach up to the sky, the heavens, whether that means just reaching into the sky or actually reaching up and going into the heavenly realms. That's debatable. I would argue that it might be a little bit of both. In Genesis 11:7, we see, "Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand another speech." So this word confuse is actually where Babel gets its name from. Babel means confusion. So the Tower of Babel, the Tower of Confusion. Babylon, again, confusion. So we're going to take a look. Who exactly is speaking here? Come, let us go down. Notice that it's plural. And then, of course, we're talking about going down, which would mean that whoever is coming down must be coming from above. It sounds very similar to what we were reading in earlier Genesis when we saw Elohim said, "Let us make man in our image." And as we outlined when we talk about Elohim, Elohim is more than just the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. When we take a look in the book of Psalms, we can clearly see that in Psalms, Elohim is also used when referring to angels. We'll also be covering in the book of Job. In Job, when it talks about Benai Elohim, or the sons of God, again, we're referring to angels. So it's the angels that went down to go and confuse their tongue. We can actually see this more clearly in a book called the Book of Jasher. As I mentioned in these studies, we will focus on the Bible, but I will point out some overlaps when I find them in books like Jubilees, Jasher, etc. Here, if we take a look in the book of Jasher, we can see, "And the Lord knew their thoughts, and it came to pass when they were building, they cast arrows towards the heavens, and all the arrows fell upon them and filled with blood. And when they saw them, they said to each other, Surely we have slain all those that are in heaven." Now here's the important part. "And God said to 70 angels who stood foremost before him, to those who were near him, saying, Come, let us descend and confuse their tongues, that one man shall not understand the language of his neighbor. And they did so unto them. And from the following day they forgot each man his neighbor's tongue, and they could not understand to speak in one tongue." So we can see here 70 angels went down, and then they had divided their tongues. So we can assume there were 70 languages, or if there was one religion in Babylon, there's 70 now. Here's some more details, which I thought were interesting. "And the building of the tower was unto them a transgression and a sin, and they began to build it. And whilst they were building against the Lord God of heaven, they imagined in their hearts to war against him and ascend into heaven." So their idea was they weren't just going to build a tower to heaven. You can see here in Jasher, they were building a tower to heaven to make war against the heavens, to ascend into heaven. "And all these people and all the families divided themselves in 3 parts. The first said, We will ascend into heaven and fight against him. The second said, We will ascend to heaven and place our own gods there and serve them. And the third part said, We will ascend to heaven and smite him with bows and spears. And God knew all their works and all their evil thoughts, and he saw the city and the tower which they were building." So there was a very malicious motive with the building of this tower. We're going to do a closer analysis now of Genesis chapter 6. We overviewed and we brought up these terms such as the sons of God, Benai Elohim. We also looked at the idea of the Nephilim. Let's try to answer what those are. So Genesis 6, what are the Nephilim and who are the sons of God? So what are the Nephilim? Or in some translations, you'll see the word giants. Genesis 6:4, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of man and bore children with them." Okay, so the 2 words we're looking at here are Nephilim and sons of God. We're starting with Nephilim. Nephilim is Strong's Concordance 5303. It says here, giants, names of 2 peoples, one before the flood and one after. Now, it's important to point that out because we see Nephilim actually only 3 times in the Bible. This word shows up exactly 3 times. We see it once in Genesis 6:4, that's the first time we see it, and then we see it twice in Numbers 13, actually in the same sentence. If we look at Genesis 6:1-4 and read it all in context, it says, "And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh, yet his days will also be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, and they bare children unto them. The same became the mighty men which were of old, men of renown." If we take a look at this word Nephilim in Strong's Concordance, we don't really get much more for details. What we can see is we can see the word Nephilim or giants in the verses it shows up, and we can see the 3 verses. So Genesis 6, actually 2 verses, Genesis 6:4, and then Numbers 13:33, where it appears twice in the same sentence. In Numbers 13:33, we can actually see that the Nephilim are the descendants of Anak. So Anak is actually, we'll cover this later, he is a descendant of a child called Esau. We can see that the word origin of Nephilim comes from the word Nephal. So with Nephal, it means to lie or to fall. Now, some people have speculated that since the Nephilim were the children of something that came from heaven and something that was below, they use the word Nephal in the sense that, well, these are fallen angels and the children of fallen angels. Speculation could be. We don't quite know for sure because we don't have much use of this word in Hebrew in the Bible. It's very rarely used, so we can't get that much context from just the Bible. So in the situations where we're stuck with a word that we can't necessarily see enough examples of its usage in the Bible, we have to look to outside books, or we can look at other translations of the Bible, such as the Greek Septuagint. The reason why I like the Greek Septuagint is because I can take a look at a mindset that's much, much older than my own. The problem is when we're doing our studies, we're looking with a very modern mindset. We're trying to basically apply our worldview and read the pages of the Bible, which is a completely different worldview, obviously, from that time. And we can't quite put ourselves in their shoes. So when we take a look at books like the Greek Septuagint, it was obviously a copy of the Old Testament, but at the same time, the people who were translating at that time had a worldview that was closer to the people who originally wrote it. So if we take a look at the Greek Septuagint and we look at Genesis 6:4, here we can see, again, we have this word giants. Let's just look on Google here, giants or gigantes. If we take a look at this word gigantes, we can see this goes back to Greek mythology. According to Hesiod, the giants were the offspring of Gaia, which is a name for the earth, born from the blood that fell when Uranus, the sky, was castrated by his Titan son Kronos. Kronos is also known as the Roman god Saturn. So the Greek Kronos or the Roman Saturn. Archaic and classical representation shows Gigantes as man-sized hoplites. Hoplites are heavily armed ancient Greek foot soldiers. So basically just soldiers in their armor, fully in human form. Okay, so this is interesting. If we're going to take a look at a word in the Bible, and then we see the word in Greek is gigantes, we need to see how exactly the Greeks define the gigantes. The giants or gigantes defined by the Greeks were the offspring of the earth and the sky, so Gaia and Uranus. And then we also see here with the description of these giants, when we think of the word giant, the first thing that probably comes to our mind is very tall in stature. However, from the description here we see in Greek mythology, they weren't necessarily tall in stature. We see man-sized hoplites. As a matter of fact, I did some more research into the word, and I noticed that the word earthborn or son of the earth was coming up quite often when I was looking into the word giant. So the reason we would say earthborn is because when we take a look at Hesiod's comments, since the giants were in mythology supposed to be the offspring of the earth and the sky, I kind of feel like this might actually be something that's alluding to Genesis 6:4. If the sons of God are referring to what came from the sky, and then we take a look at the idea that the giants were actually born on earth from the sons of God, so the daughters of men, well, this would be the side from the earth, that's the clay. And then, of course, we have Uranus, the sons of God, the sky. I'm just trying to look at this and rationalize and see, is this Greek mythology actually overlapping with what we heard in Genesis 6:4? So what do we know about the giants? Well, according to the Greeks, they were a race of great strength and aggression, though not necessarily of great size. In the Bible, we do see giants that are tall. We also see giants varying in size. So, for example, when we look at before the flood, especially when we look at some of the Deuterocanonical books, giants seem to be a lot taller before the flood. And we also saw the ages were longer before the flood. But then what we noticed was as we went after the flood, for example, we look at Goliath. Goliath stood 6 cubits in height. 6 cubits, we're looking at around 9 feet. Now, that is much taller than most human beings, or the majority, but it's still not as tall as some of the giants that were being described prior to the flood. Archaic and classical representations show Gigantes as man-sized hoplites, heavily armed ancient Greek foot soldiers. So we already talked about the idea that the Greek representation, the early representations, were man-sized creatures. Later representations after 380 BC show Gigantes with snakes for legs. You will see some images of giants, and yes, their lower body is actually made up of snakes. The name Gigantes is usually taken to imply earth-born, and Hesiod's Theogony makes this explicit by having the giants be the offspring of Gaia, and Gaia was an earth goddess. What are the B'nai Elohim? B'nai Elohim we see translated in the Bible as sons of God. Now, Genesis 6:4 is probably one of the most controversial verses in the Bible because a lot of the early church fathers didn't like it. As a matter of fact, some of the early church actually came up with this very strange theology where they said the sons of God were the sons of Seth. So, in other words, when we looked at the lineage earlier, we saw Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and then Seth. Seth was the child that was born after Cain had slew Abel. A lot of these theologies are based on the idea that Cain's bloodline was the wicked bloodline and that Seth's bloodline was the good bloodline. Theology doesn't really make that much sense. It can be scrutinized in many different ways. I'll point out some of its flaws. If we were to say that Cain was the wicked bloodline, and we were to basically say since Cain slew his brother, his whole bloodline was wicked. First off, the sins of the son, or sins of the father, sorry, don't go on to the sins of the son. We know that from other verses in the Bible. But on top of that, if we take a look at the names of the children mentioned, the descendants of Cain had El in their name, and the El was coming from the word Elohim. So on both sides, Seth and Cain, we notice that the children were being named with El in their names. So to say that they were worshiping different gods or one was good, one was bad, doesn't really make that much sense because they both denoted that the God that Adam and Eve had known was their God. So that doesn't fit. Another problem we have is this. When we take a look at the Bible and we look at the idea of children being born, when we look at the idea of a man and woman coming together and having a child, that just seems to be a normal birth described throughout the Bible, at least what we've read so far. When we look at the Nephilim are described very different. If these were the sons of Seth being human beings coming into other women and then having children, it doesn't make that much sense that you have to define them as being different. So the Nephilim definitely sound like there's something that is very different. They're a very unique kind of a birth. And if this was just a regular human birth, it wouldn't be outlined like this. When we look at the words B'nai Elohim, we first get the word Ben or Bain, means a son. We can see here also the word children sometimes is used, so children or son. We also have the word Elohim. Remember Elohim, we're talking about a type. We're talking a heavenly type. So we're not just talking Father, Son, Holy Spirit here. We're talking angels as well. So then when we see this, we have sons of God or children of Elohim. This is why some people have tried to bend this and say this was the sons of Seth, since we're all children of God. But I'm going to prove to you that this is not talking about the sons of Seth very explicitly. Job 1:6 says, one day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. So here's what I'm going to do. If we're going to read the Bible and we're going to be consistent, if we're going to define the sons of God are something, well, then when we look at other parts of the Bible, we have to be consistent. So here, if we look at the sons of God, we have to say that Job's sons of God must be the same sons of God that we'd be dealing with in Genesis, or we're being horribly inconsistent. So here we can see these sons of God actually present themselves to the Lord, and Satan came with them. Where have you come from? Said the Lord to Satan. From roaming through the earth, he replied, and walking back and forth in it. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one on earth like him, a man who is blameless and upright and who fears God and shuns evil. So Job Job is an individual that believed in the God of Israel. And here, Job is just giving you some context. There was a challenge going on here. Satan is looking for fault with the people who believe in God and serve God. And so here we can see a conversation between God and Satan. And at this point here, God is pushing forth his servant Job and saying, hey, he's upright, he serves me, he shuns evil. This story, I strongly recommend you read it. It'll really help you on those days you're being tried and going through your own tribulations, because Job went through some very intense tribulation. When we take a look at this verse and we look at the Bible commentaries, here's Barnes' notes on the Bible, and it's talking about this verse we just read. Again, there was a day. See notes at Job 1:6. These seasons are represented as periodical, when the angels came, as it were, to make report to God what they have observed and done. Okay, so here from this Bible commentary, it clearly defines who was with Satan, the angels. Okay, so it's quite unlikely that you would be seeing the sons of Seth going before the Lord back and forth, but angels have to give a report. So here we're seeing Satan playing his role of a prosecutor, basically trying to throw blame at Job. And then we're seeing the angels who travel with him. But that's only one commentary. Here's another one. Jameson Fawcett Brown Bible Commentary. This is Job chapter 2, which is once again Satan and the angels going in front of God to test Job. So here we see a day appointed for the angels giving an account of their ministry to God. The words to present himself before the Lord occur here, though not in Job 1:6, as Satan now has a special report to make as to Job. So this is the second appearance of Satan before God, testing Job. And again, we can see in both chapter 1 and chapter 2, the sons of God are referred to as the angels. And here's a final one, Geneva Study Bible. Again, there was a day when A, the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and B, Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. We can see that A, the sons of God, is again defined as the angels. So 3 different Bible commentaries, all 3 agree that the sons of God, B'nai Elohim, are in fact the angels, which means when we're reading Genesis 6:4, whether we like it or not, you have a situation that happened before the flood where angels came amongst human women and they created something new. Job 1:6, we're going to compare this now to the Septuagint, so the Greek. One day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. And then if we see in the Greek, I highlighted the word here that I'm overlapping with sons of God. And if we take a look and we translate it, we get angeloi. Angeloi, as we know from the New Testament, that's an angel. So there's no lack of confirmation, whether we look in the Greek Septuagint or the commentaries, or we're just being consistent with how we read the Bible. There's no way you can take this word sons of God and transform it into the sons of Seth. Whether you like it or not, and this goes for the early church fathers as well, the Bible says what it says, and the fact is that you had angels make a new offspring with human women, and those were called the Nephilim, or in the Greeks called them the Gigantes. So the question is, did angels really have children with humans? Well, it seems to say that they bore children, and these children were the Nephilim. But let's go a little bit farther. Now we're going to take a look at the book of Enoch. The book of Enoch actually talks about Genesis chapter 6 in Enoch chapter 6. It says, and it came to pass when the children of men had multiplied that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. You can clearly tell from this first sentence here, that there is Genesis 6:4. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, come, let us choose wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. Sounds very clear here that what we're talking about is angels having children with human women. And it says, and Samyaza, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone will have to pay the penalty of a great sin. It goes on in chapter 7. And all the others together with them took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one, and they began to go in unto them, and to defile themselves with them, and they taught them charms and enchantments, and the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. This is very interesting. So it wasn't just the fact that angels and human women had their own offspring. We can see here that the women were learning things from the angels. So when we see charms, enchantments, cutting of roots, and acquainted with the plants, you could say medicine, or you could also say sorcery, because we know sorcery has to do with drugs. And drugs we're talking about here, plants. We're talking about plants that cause you to hallucinate. So perhaps the whole concept of sorcery and magic was something that was bestowed from the angels who had more knowledge than us. It goes on and says, and they became pregnant, and they bare great giants. Okay, that's nail in the coffin. Whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind, and they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. Then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. Okay, so nail in the coffin, we can clearly see, at least in the book of Enoch, angels and human women came together. They had children. These children were called Nephilim in Hebrew, or giants, Gigantes. And we can see here that the giants started to devour everything, and they were sinning against the animals. So how exactly they were sinning against the animals? We can see that they were devouring one another's flesh and drinking the blood. So we already covered the idea in Genesis that you're not supposed to consume blood. What were the giants doing? Consuming blood. And it looks like perhaps this is when the diet started to change. So we can see that in the older part of Genesis, or the older part of the beginning of Genesis, in the beginning of Genesis, we see there was one diet, and this diet was associated to plants, seeds, and fruit. But then all of a sudden, we see that after the flood, you can eat meat, but there can't be blood in it. Well, this probably started to take place right here with the giants. So perhaps when we look at how the world was full of iniquity, perhaps what started in Genesis 6:4, by the time of the days of Noah, had reached a level that was just out of control. Perhaps there was problems with the gene pool as well, because if you have a lot of individuals that are becoming changed from what the original creation was, however that might be, you might have a problem with genetics. If we take a look here at the Greek Septuagint again, and we're looking at the interlinear verses, we can see for sure that there was procreation that happened here, because if we look at the Septuagint and we look at the Old Testament in Genesis 6:4 and read through, we can see this word procreated, which means for sure that we're talking about sons of God, angels, which we already saw, Gigantes, which is supposed to be the children, and then we have this idea of procreation. How they procreated, I'm not sure. I understand from my readings of the Bible that angels or celestial beings are made of one substance, and that earthly beings are made of are terrestrials. They're made of a different substance. How they did it exactly, I'm still trying to figure this out. But I have noticed that there's this word watcher that shows up quite often when you read some of the deuterocanonical biblical writings. The deuterocanonical books use the word watcher, and watcher will lead you to a word that's egregore. And egregore is a thought form. So I've wondered if what we consider thoughts could also be something that would be conscious. Perhaps the angels, since they don't have the same physical body that we do, they could be more equated to a thought form. But this is just a theory of mine. So questions from the study. Again, if you have questions, you can send them to questions@ezekiel333.com. If you get them in by Monday, hopefully for the Wednesday, I should have some slides together so I can do a really good job answering your questions to the best of my ability. The questions we had was pertaining to the law in regards to when we talked about blood and we were talking about the idea that life was in the blood. The question that came up was pertaining to what is this idea about life in the blood? In Hebrews 9:22, it says, according to the law, in fact, nearly everything must be purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. So the key here is, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. So what was the blood of an animal supposed to be used for? Forgiveness. The shedding of blood led to forgiveness. Okay, so when someone transgresses the law, when someone transgresses the 10 Commandments, the blood was used for the sake of forgiveness, for purification. Let's see, there's more on that. Leviticus 17:11. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul. So again, we're talking about sin. We're talking about transgression of the law. And here we see, for the life of the flesh is in the blood. So what was that blood supposed to be used for? For an atonement for you. So when you make a mistake, that blood was specifically supposed to be used for atonement for your sins. In Hebrews 9:22, it says again, for the life of the flesh is its blood. Therefore, I have told the Israelites, you must not eat the blood of any living thing, because the life of all flesh is its blood. Whoever eats it must be cut off. So this was a very serious thing. This comes up multiple times in the Bible. You also see this in books like the book of Jasher, where it's said repeatedly, do not eat blood. I believe it's in Jubilees as well. So it was a very big deal that you don't consume blood. Did that rule change in the New Testament? So is it okay? Can we have our steaks raw now? Can we have them dripping with blood? Is there a difference? Let's take a look. In Acts 15:20, instead, we should write and tell them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, and from the meat strangled by animals, and from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood. So we can see in the book of Acts, Acts of the Apostles, this is after the gospel. So we're talking after the crucifixion. We can clearly tell you are still not supposed to consume the blood of an animal. So whether we look at the Old Testament or New Testament, I mean, if some of you have been taught the law's been done away with, it's not going to save you here, because here you can clearly tell you still cannot eat the blood of an animal, because we're seeing this in the book of Acts. Some of the reasons why you might not want to eat animals' blood, well, parasites. If you look at this article from the CDC, some parasites spend most of their life cycle in the bloodstream. And you'll have to excuse my pronunciation, such as Babesia and Plasmodium species. Parasites such as Trypanosoma cruzi might be found in the blood early in an infection. Okay, so here we can see a reason scientifically why you might not want to consume blood. So if you're not, following rules for just following rules, let's try to figure out an answer for the rules. An answer would be you might actually pick up parasites eating an animal's blood. Now here's one that should be quite familiar. When candida is in your bloodstream, the condition is called candidemia. Candida infection can spread from your bloodstream to other parts of your body, such as your eyes, kidney, liver, and brain. If this happens, it's called invasive candidemia. So a lot of people are familiar with candida. I myself went in and had a wet blood sample done to take a look at candida. And what I found under the microscope is you can see your cells kind of floating through like it's snow. And then what you'll find are these little serpent-looking things, which are the candida, and they do damage to the cells. Seeing that under a microscope was very real for me, because I was able to actually see parasites in my own blood. Now, it's quite common that all of us have some candida. It's just one type of parasite. But again, we find this specifically in the blood. So if you're used to eating your steaks rare and you're consuming that blood, chances are you're consuming candida. Now, candida will cause a whole bunch of different ailments in the body. There's a huge list. For any of you who've bothered to research it, I strongly recommend you do. And we're only talking one type of parasite here. Candida can cause everything from headaches to eczema, stomach problems. I mean, the list is quite large, and it really varies on who you take a look at. But that's just one type of parasite. So again, if we actually followed what the Bible said, it wouldn't just be a matter of keeping rules for rules. We can see scientifically we could free ourselves from a lot of health issues by not taking in a bunch of parasites. And obviously, as you start to get one or two parasites, that's one thing. But as you start to kind of multiply over a lifetime how many parasites are in the body, that's when things can get really out of control. So our reading for next week, we're going to look at Genesis chapters 12 to 17. So we finished to 11 today. So we'll read chapter 12, and we'll read all the way through 17 to the end of 17. Again, if you have questions, you can send your questions to questions@ezekiel333.com. You can also check out the website as well, but we'll take a look at the questions on Mondays. We'll basically see if there's any questions in the email, and then I'll be able to take those questions and then make a couple slides to answer those questions that are following session. Aside from that, I will see you all next week at 6 p.m. Thank you once again for joining me.
For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of the dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Brothers and sisters, the sword is coming. If you hear the watchman's call, please repent and seek out Jesus Christ. There is still time. that at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow.